Out there. Welcome to the No Shit Cast, flagship podcast, the X Factory Creative Network. I'm your host, Matt Frazier. Tonight's guest is Mr. Stephen D. Sullivan, an award-winning author, artist, and editor. Since 1980, he has worked on a wide variety of properties, including well-known licenses and original work. Some of his best-known projects include Dungeons & Dragons, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Dragonlance, Iron Man, Legend of the Five Rings, Speed Racer, the Tolkien RPG, Disney Afternoons, Star Wars, The Twilight Empire, Uncanny Radio, Martians, Nights, and Tournament of Death, and I guess the guy also never sleeps. My co-host tonight, the Grey Wizard of History himself, Mr. Eric D. Smith. How you doing there, Mr. Smith?
Pretty good, Matt. How are you doing tonight?
Not too bad. For housekeeping, we don't have a whole lot this time, but what do we got coming up for guests here in the next couple weeks?
Well, on the 10th of February, we have DJ version 666 coming up, and then on the 17th, we have Dr. Cooperman, who is a professor of playwriting, and
yeah, that's our first in-studio guest right there. Dr. Cooperman is.
Yeah,
yep.
Yeah. And on the 24th, Skip Williams, and on the 3rd, we have Muggsy from Australia,
musical guest. Yep.
Yeah. And then you're on vacation on the 10th and 17th, and then Dr. Young, who is a doctor of music theory and history, on the 24th.
Very cool. Well, awesome stuff. Well, putting that aside then, let's get straight to our guest tonight. Stephen, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing pretty well today. How are you guys doing?
Fantastic.
Great. How'd your dinner go with your family?
The dinner was actually breakfast, and it went really well. We had a great time. So it's my wife's birthday tomorrow, and so the house is full of our children right now, and we went out with her mom and her brother, and we had a really good time. And her brother's stepchild. Like, how do we explain all these? Anyway, there were a bunch of us. We went out. We had breakfast. We had a good time. Spent too much time talking about stuff at the table. They were trying to show us the door, but we stuck around and ate for an hour and a half anyway. So.
Sounds good.
And then I came back here to discover I had no actual three-prong outlets in the room that I wanted to record in, because the rest of the house is full of people making noise. So.
Well, we definitely appreciate you being on the show and taking the time to do that out away from your family and stuff. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. And I heard the long list you gave, and I wanted, since this has come up a couple of times with other people recently, I did want to mention that I worked on the original Chill role-playing game. I was one of the part of the team that created that, and I was the art director at that company for the entirety of its existence. Yeah, Pacesetter.
We talked about that.
Yeah,
Eric
we talked about it. Yeah,
I don't know how we missed that, because that's one of the things later with the paranormal stuff that I really wanted to make sure I talked to you about too. So I don't know how we forgot to put that in there.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. If I hadn't been talking to someone about it online this morning, it might not have popped into my head as quick as it did. But that's something that we worked on in the middle of the 1980s, and I'm one of the things I'm really proudest of all the crazy stuff that I've done. And it's been a lot of crazy stuff, because I've been at this a really long time now. And I guess that not dying has something to do with that. Hopefully that's a trend I can continue that trend for another
as long as you can.
It's so optimistic, right? I'm not dead, so let's do it again.
Yep.
I'm shooting for 111. That's my goal.
Right on.
I want to get that Hobbit 111. So.
Yeah, that's within the projected oldest age now. They project that about as old as you can live with current technology is 115.
And they're putting mouse ears on mice and doing crazy stuff with DNA. You know what I mean? Who knows?
I figure the longer I hang on, the longer I can live, and the more chance I have of being the head in the jar from Futurama. So.
Exactly. Yeah. That's my goal right there. I want to be one of the heads in the jars in Futurama.
There's telomere research, too, going on. Telomeres are the things that are at the bottom of your DNA that keeps them from unraveling, and you lose a little bit of them every time your DNA replicates. But there's actually a company that has been working on restoring those telomeres. I don't know.
And that would be really cool. My worry about all that kind of super science, and I keep meaning to write a short story or something about this, but who has time? I'm so busy.
Apparently.
Writing other stories.
All of that really cool stuff is only going to be available to super rich, and what we're going to end up with is an immortal class of billionaires. It'll be trillionaires probably by then. And the rest of us will be living in abject feudal poverty. So that's my fear.
That's the whole precedence for that new Netflix series. What's it called?
Altered Carbon.
Altered Carbon.
Yeah.
Is that the very rich keep living over, and every time they live over again, they just accumulate more power, more wealth, and then there's just like them, and then if you're not one of them, you're sort of like a slave class. It appears.
Well, so far the only person that's got this telomere treatment is the head of the company that researches it. So. A very rich and powerful person is the first person that's done this, and I imagine she will be in control of the company for quite some time.
I don't know. Yeah. Don't you guys fear, though, that...
Darn it, it's another one of my ideas that I've had for like 20 years and just haven't gotten around
to writing
it.
Yeah.
Now stumbled upon and will make a lot of money while I sit here in abject poverty staring at closets full of clothes.
See, I'm one of those guys that believes it's going to be something like that, right? And then it's going to seem great for 10 years, but that's when the zombie apocalypse is going to start. It's because everybody went and screwed with their DNA, and the people that didn't won't have this problem. They'll just age and die, but the people that did are just going to all like start mutating into something.
Just make sure.
I'm so optimistic.
Be our vampire overlords.
Yeah, right.
As long as it's just zombies, make sure when people die, you tie their shoestrings together.
Yeah.
That should solve most of the zombie apocalypse right there.
Right, or you bury them face down, right? Because they're not smart enough to dig upward.
Right.
Yeah.
That's like an old. I don't remember if that was vampires or there was some kind of monster. Maybe it was ghouls. Maybe it was vampires. Maybe it was zombies. That you buried them face down. So when they started digging out, they'd actually be digging all the way to the center of the earth.
God, yeah, and they used to have tombstones that had bells on them
with a string that went down into the grave. Yeah,
in case in case people were buried alive, or to alert locals, I suppose, if anything was stirring unnaturally.
Isn't that the whole point of the term wake? That period of time between when someone's dead and before you stuff them in the ground, you have a wake where you give them a period of time.
Yeah, and you hang around with them for a while just to make sure.
Yeah.
And all that comes from, before we had as good science as we have now, when people would fall into a cataleptic state or a coma or something like that and appear to be dead. Yeah. And then, as Monty Python would say, you're not quite dead yet.
Right, yeah. Mostly dead.
Which, you get buried in the ground or crackle, burned up. That's a bit of a shock.
Yeah.
And Poe was into that. I mean, that was, I remember that from a lot of Poe stories, Poe movies. There were the kind of the bell that will signal that I'm not really dead. In fact, there was even a Dark Shadows arc with that.
Really?
In which Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, Joan Bennett's character, was buried alive, and she was afraid she was going to be buried alive, and she actually had this bell system rigged up, and eventually the bells rang. They came and got her. It was not like a little bell either. It was like church bells, as I remember it. So.
Oh, wow! Everybody pay attention in the village.
Right. Yeah.
How the hell did we end up
to have like a little cat door bell out in the middle of the cemetery?
Help me! Help me!
I'm sorry. It's 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night. No one's in the cemetery.
Right.
Just call back later.
Sucks to be you.
But hey, you can't be more prepared for death, I guess.
Well, now they embalm you, right? So you're just dead. There's no coming back from that once they stuff you in the ground.
Once they put the embalming fluid, unless you're Dr. Phibes, you're pretty much done.
Yeah, that's it. It's over.
So, man, I have to ask, where did all this start for you? Like, where did you get your interest in fiction of various nature and wanting to be involved with that and produce things like that?
I've been a monster kid literally ever since I can remember. I don't remember not being crazy about monsters and anything that resembled a monster. And I think, like most kids, that probably starts with dinosaurs when you're little. I remember, one of my early monster memories is on my 5th birthday getting a Triceratops model kit, and that was the coolest thing in the world. And obviously by then I was already way into dinosaurs and could tell you all the then existent ones and that kind of stuff. And so I think my monster love grew out of that, but I kind of don't remember when it happened because it literally happened, well more than 50 years ago at this point. It's just kind of all my life. And it continued. And I happen to be lucky enough to be in the end of what I guess they say is the official Monster Kid generation, which is the generation that kind of grew up in the early days of famous monsters of filmland.
Yeah, like the Universal monster movies.
And the Universal monster movies and that kind of stuff. But there was kind of a whole monster culture back then. There was, the Monsters and the Addams Family were on TV when I was small. Yeah. There was Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which had monsters in it almost every week. There was Lost in Space. There was Star Trek a little later on, The Outer Limits of Twilight Zone. All of those are from kind of that generation. And I was born right at the end of the 50s. And the late 50s and early 60s, there was just a lot of sci-fi horror monster stuff going on. And
the Blob.
Right, the Blob. And the Harryhausen movies, of course. Harryhausen's a huge influence on my life. Yeah. And Forrest J. Ackerman had famous Monsters of Filmland coming out then. And, once you found that magazine on a newsstand somewhere or a convenience store, which is where I think I first got it, it was like, oh my God, there are other people like me.
Yeah.
They want to hang pictures of Boris Karloff on their wall.
Right.
Wow.
And then Dark Shadows came along right in that same time in the middle of the 1960s.
And that was sort of like a vampiric soap opera, right?
Right. Well, Dark Shadows had one of the main characters was a vampire. It started out as just a gothic soap opera in the kind of the tradition of Wuthering Heights, a rich family living in an isolated area where the governess comes in. I guess that's actually more like Rebecca. And their trials and tribulations, but it was struggling with that, and so they started introducing supernatural elements. And so they started with a ghost, and then they, for whatever reason, and this is kind of one of the unique, crazy things they did, there was the mother of one of the supposedly kind of orphan child turned out to be an immortal being called Phoenix who would die in fire and then be reborn. Mm-hmm. So she showed up to kind of burn the house down and burn her little boy up and that kind of stuff. And then after that, I guess that was successful enough. They were literally on the verge of cancellation. They were like, well, we might as well try anything we can. And they said, well, let's do a vampire. And through a variety of basically dumb luck in which the casting director actually took the person that the director hadn't said. It was like they had two people up for it. They miscommunicated. But the guy that got to play the vampire was Jonathan Thrid, who was basically just a stage actor in the New York area looking for work. And he played Barnabas. And once Barnabas came on the show, the ratings shot through the roof, and people started watching it like crazy. And once they had the vampire, they just never turned back. After that, they did witches, they did werewolves, they did the Portrait of Dorian Gray, they did a Cthulhu mythos kind of thing. They covered in the 1,220 or something episodes that they did, they covered pretty much every horror sci-fi trope that they could dig up in the format of a soap opera, 5 days a week. And it was, people make fun of it now in some areas because it's clearly low budget, but basically they were shooting it live to air. So they would shoot in one day. They had no ability to edit it pretty much unless something really horrendous happened. Then they had to go through a huge set of convolutions to do that. So it was always kind of one take, one scene, one take. We're moving on. We're shooting them into order. So the result of that is that sometimes it's very sloppy feeling by modern standards. But the fact is they were doing this 5 days a week for 6 years or something like that, releasing them almost immediately upon finishing them.
And when was this? What era was this?
This was, I think they started in 1966 and they ended in 72.
Okay.
But I might be off a year on either end.
It was really the beginning of the technological advancements in broadcast television and stuff too. So they because they probably were they black? They were black and white, right?
They started black and white,
right.
And then they converted to color at one point. And all of them are now available, I think, on Amazon streaming, I think for free. But you can also buy, there's like a number of box sets or a number of compilations you could buy, and you can also buy the 1,200 episode set as well. And there's a couple of friends of mine on Facebook that are actually hadn't seen it before and are now going through it. I saw a whole bunch of it when it was first on the air. It was broadcast originally in the Boston area early in the morning, which was bad for us school kids. But as soon as and I would actually, after I discovered it, I was like, oh, I'm sick today. I have a fever.
Well, you're from
and I would stay home and watch Dark Shadows occasionally. But after they moved it to the afternoon, it became a regular ritual with all school kids of like mind. And my brother and I used to rush home from school every day and get to watch it twice because it was on Boston and Providence. And they got out of sync. So it was like Providence, which was earlier, was a day behind. So every day you could watch an hour of Dark Shadows. You bet yesterday's episode and then a new one. And we did that until the series ended. So
you're a New Englander.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I was born in Illinois, but I was raised in New England, in Sharon, Massachusetts, which is, no one knows where that is, but it's right next to Foxborough where the Patriots play.
Oh, I know where it is. I had season tickets for 14 years to the Patriots.
When they were good or back in the day?
I started in Foxborough with Drew Bledsoe, to give you an idea. So that's when I got the tickets, and then I was with them all the way through and into Gillette, and I had them until about 11 years ago. 10 years ago was when I got rid of them finally. But yeah, I lived in New England, between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. I lived there for 22 years. So very familiar with what you're talking about there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love New England. It's a great place. But back when I lived out there, I moved out here to Wisconsin in 1980 to work at TSR.
Right.
Back in the day, the Patriots were like the poor fourth team of the Celtics, the Bruins, the Red Sox, in no particular order, and then the Patriots. In fact, they were so uninteresting to most of us that Steve Grogan, who was the last quarterback in the NFL that actually called his own plays,
right?
He lived next to a girlfriend of mine.
You kidding?
And I never bothered to meet him. I played cards with his wife once, but it was a Patriots guy. I lived next door to Kirsten and her family. It was no big deal.
Well, it's a big deal now, boy. Holy cow. Yeah. I mean, that if you haven't, have you been back into that area since obviously they started dominating everything NFL?
Yes. Yeah, my mom still lives out there. And actually, my daughter worked for the Patriots own a soccer team called the Revolution.
Yep.
And this last season, my daughter worked for them. So
no kidding,
she just moved back out here. So sadly, she's not going to do the Revs anymore. But yeah, so I've kept up. I've been to the new stadium. Haven't seen a game there, but
it's amazing. There's not a bad seat in that place. It's amazing. It's just it's amazing. I can't say any. You just have to go because and you can actually probably still get tickets to that. Since I moved out here so long ago, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Green Bay fan. The Patriots are my second team. Backa.
But it's like you had season tickets. You know what the season ticket? You know how long you have to wait to get a chance at season tickets at Green Bay? I think it's still upwards of 25 or 30 years.
Yeah, those tickets are willed. Right, they're put in trusts and stuff so that they stay in the families and things like that.
My kids are mad that we didn't sign them up when they were infants, which one of my friends did with his kids. So now they're getting toward the front of now that they're grown up, they're getting near the front of the list.
It's sad. I mean, or maybe it's just I'm a wuss, but whatever. But it got to a point though, man, where I started preferring to sit at home and watch the games. Because number one, I didn't wake up the next day with a migraine from the screaming and yelling and all that kind of stuff. And it's not that it was. I mean, it's New England. The weather's the weather, just like you probably have there in Wisconsin. You don't even
it's almost exactly like Wisconsin. We're a little bit colder.
It's miserable. Welcome to the North. I mean, it's just part of life, right? And so going to the games and fighting with the traffic. I mean, it was a 12-hour event to go see one football game, sometimes even more. if there was tailgating with friends involved and things like that. But I don't know. I just got to the point where and it wasn't that the seats were bad or anything like that. And it was a wonderful experience. But man, the next day I just felt like someone beat me with a hammer. I just couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah. Since you've got the name of the podcast being what it is, I assume I'm okay to swear. It's
Absolutely.
Like, at some point you say, I'm getting too old for this shit.
Yep.
So I understand. Anyway, I warned you we were going to digress.
That's fine.
Yeah, not a problem at all. And I'm good at.
We moved from monster movies to football.
Well,
I didn't come here to talk about football.
I'm good at getting back on track. I was wondering, because see, I've actually never seen a football game in its entirety in real life or on TV, and I know nothing about it. That's why I'm being quiet. But so it's like a mystery to me. But what I was wondering though was, like, at this time that you were getting into this monster culture when you were younger and stuff, how much was that represented in comic books? I know that there was a lot of hero things going on in comic books, but did that monster culture, was it able to be represented in that medium? Because I don't think there was a lot of pulp novels about that sort of thing, was there?
The weird thing was that at the time was kind of, when I first started getting into monsters, was almost a gap in the monster comic tradition, because EC comics were gone by then because of all the controversy with Comic Code and all that bullshit. And Warren had its line of Creepy Eerie Vampirella, I think, was going at that point, but I was a little too young for that. But I did start right at the same time Dark Shadows was wrapping up. I started getting into comic books in kind of a serious way, and one of the reasons I did was because of Spider-Man 101, I think it was, that had Morbius the Living Vampire in it, and it's like, ooh, vampire, Spider-Man.
Huh, cool.
Two great things that go great together.
Yeah.
How could I not buy this comic?
You got your vampire in my Spider-Man. You got your Spider-Man in my vampire. Yeah.
And then, because of Dan Curtis and Dark Shadows basically created the kind of supernatural horror revolution of the early 70s with the television show, and then Dan Curtis did the original Night Stalker movie, which is still one of the best television movies.
Oh,
ever
yeah.
made.
Kolchak the Night Stalker.
Series, and he did Dracula with Jack Palance and all this kind of stuff. Until he did Winds of War, Dan Curtis was Mr. Horror sci-fi guy in terms of television. And that was so strong that at the time, even the kids' books clubs had books that you would never find in a book club at school today. For instance, I have a book of true witchcraft spells and incantations and formulas that I got, I think, in 6th grade that has all this medieval stuff in it. It was like, okay, you cut the ear off a black cat and you boil it in the milk from a black cow at midnight, and then if you wear it on your thumb, you'll become invisible. And it has all these magic circles and inscribed things. I've got another one that's called Astrology and Other Occult Games. And these were from Scholastic Book Club.
Yeah.
Wow.
Holy crap.
People that are younger than me are probably going, how is that even possible?
Yeah,
but
really.
It was, because it was a huge cultural phenomenon. And right around then, at the start of the 1970s, Marvel got into horror comics as well, with Werewolf by Night and Tomb of Dracula, and could never put this comic out today. Well, they probably could, but only because it's that old. Son of Satan, and a whole bunch of other Tales of the Zombie and all that kind of stuff. And all that bloomed in the 1970s when I was, older age kid and into a teenager.
That's really interesting, because to hear that from your perspective, being interested in that and living in those times, because I did my historical thesis on the Satanic Panic and first edition AD&D, and I started off tracing it back to the occult panic, the cult panic that was before that, where you had people like Ted Patrick kidnapping people off the street out of cults and reprogramming them, as it were, and
right.
all the cults coming in, like the Moonies, the Buddhists, and all of that, into what became the Satanic.
We should point out that the Buddhists aren't really a cult.
Right. No, that's true. But I mean, they were subsumed in what Americans felt at that time was cultish because they didn't understand the religion. So
right. Well, there were certainly cultish Eastern religions at the time. And in fact, when I was at, I think it was a New York City Comic-Con, it might have been a Marvel Comic-Con in the around 1974 5, I think, I almost got picked up by a Mooney girl and taken to the Reverend Some Young Moon's Unification Church for a meeting. This was a very cute girl.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah.
And I was a 15-year-old boy on the streets of New York City by myself, and this girl is like, "You want to come with me?" I'm like, "Well, maybe."
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not saying that any of those religions are bad. It's just what people perceived at this point in time in America and stuff. And
the Moonies are kind of nutty.
Well, listen, you're right, because one of my favorite definitions. Okay, what's the difference between a religion and a cult?
I give up.
In a cult, somebody writes down all kinds of rules and whatever guidance, whatever they write down. Okay, and that person is still there to make changes. Once that person in a religion, it's the exact same thing except that person's dead. So now it's canon. Now it's solidified. So that's like the big
and open for interpretation.
And that's the big differentiator between what's a religion, what's a cult.
But yeah, I mean, these movies were on the rise back then too. There was Rosemary's Baby coming out around that time, and The Omen, The Exorcist.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, it's weird that there was this contrivance of influences that all led into the same situation. I mean, and of course, D&D came out around that time, and of course was blamed for being heavily occult.
Which it never was.
Right.
Just for the record.
It wasn't? Well, what the hell? That's what I sold my soul to. If it's
well,
I got there fairly early in 1980, and there was literally no one at DSR that was a devil worshiper, even a pagan at that point.
No special basement ceremonial rooms or anything like that?
There weren't. It was kind of an ongoing joke among us at the company until the people at the top started worrying about it too much. There was a pretty famous incident near, it had to be around 1981, where in the art department on the second floor of the TSR used to be, the creative departments were above the dungeon hobby shop on the second and third floors of an old hotel building that was literally falling down and had holes in the ceiling and stuff. But it was a cool place to be and very creative. And in the art department on the second floor, there was a pie chart that I don't remember. I think it was Jeff D. had made up, but Bill Willingham and Errol Otis may have had a hand in it too, that said percentage of devil worshippers in gaming companies. And it had tiny little slice of Avalon Hill and a tiny little slice for SBI and other little companies like that. And then a good 90% of the chart was TSR. And we all got a good laugh at that until one day an executive stumbled by and was like, had some mucky muck with them. And they're like,
and they saw
these guys, they're so funny. You guys take that down.
Everybody out of the pool. I never want to see that again. Don't let that ever happen again.
Exactly. No, I mean, it was literally, they laughed. They pretended to laugh about it. And then, I don't remember if it was a memo or if it was a spoken word order that if that was not down, immediately people would be fired. So
yeah,
it was, but there were literally, in 1980, there were literally no people at TSR that I know of, and it was a fairly small company. It was I was the 95th person hired, I think, at the time. And when I left, I was had worked up to 30 on the seniority list. But there was no one there that was actually into the occult or any of that kind of stuff in any way other than the way us usual monster kids were into monsters and talking about fake witchcraft and all that kind of all the stuff that we'd read about in the books and seen in the TV shows and movies we'd seen.
Well, and a lot of it was predicated on that. Like, for instance, being able to kill a Rakasta with a blessed crossbow bolt, like that specific stuff like that. That directly came from Kolchak the Night Stalker episode.
Right. Exactly.
So, and things like Magic Missile, I believe, did too, those kind of things.
Magic Missile, I think, was from the Edgar Allan Poe, quote unquote, The Raven, which Roger Corman did with Vincent Price and Boris Karloff. I think that may have come from that. But unfortunately, Gary is the one to ask about that.
Right. Yeah,
sadly.
I remember seeing him in an interview, him and Dieter.
Dieter Sturm?
Yeah, Dieter. Yeah, and they were being asked directly by a television interviewer for a newscasting place about.
It was probably 60 Minutes, which was a total fiasco. But okay.
It may have been, but and he looked perplexed. I mean, overall, he looked. It reminded me of the look that Orson Welles had on his face when he was trying to explain to the federal government. No, it was just a story, man.
Right.
Just a story.
We just made it up. What are you guys tripping about?
Yeah, it was that same look. It was that same man, I must be dreaming. This is so surreal,
Right. How are you guys taking any of this seriously? All of us know that it's just fantasy literature and movies and television.
Yeah.
None of us believe in this stuff.
Right. And it eventually all passed. I mean, it actually went into being the super predator fear. Where people were concerned that their kids were going to shoot everybody from watching violence and video games and cable TV and stuff, So it's like...
Right. It's all kind of part of that same cloth, though. And you cited that in some ways it's got ginned up in the early 70s when the big occult supernatural new age boom started with Dark Shadows and all the other media. It's like anything that's popular will generate more of like things, right?
Yeah.
If it's popular enough. So you got, after Star Wars, you got all the bad Star Wars ripoffs. Well, when Dark Shadows was so popular and the Dan Curtis TV movies were popular, suddenly people were saying, okay, we can make these other films. Hammer was kind of at the end of its run, but the new independents were starting.
Yeah, it proved there was an audience. It proved that there was an audience for it. Of course, that's what's going to happen.
And it was a big audience, too. I mean, a small television show audience is a pretty big movie audience. At least back in the day.
That's how we ended up with sparkly vampires, remember? Right? Because vampires suddenly became a thing, and then it just kept evolving and evolved. It went from Interview with a Vampire all the way through to, metrosexual,
whatever that movie
vampires,
is called.
right?
Yeah. Twilight, right?
Twilight,
yeah. To the Twilight stuff, and in some ways you can trace that right back to, again, not to harp on Dark Shadows, which is my favorite TV show, too much. But a lot of that traces back to before Barnabas, vampires were the bad guys. But Barnabas was a vampire who didn't want to be a vampire. He was cursed, and he was sympathetic, and he was the women in the audience really loved him. So he would do bad things when he was a vampire, which wasn't always the case. They cured him and then re-inflicted him a couple of times over the course of the series. And they gave him the tragic love backstory that Dan Curtis then gave to his version of Dracula, which has been subsumed into all Dracula. Dracula now is, I think, probably believed by most of the public to have been a Prince of Wallachia who had a tragic love affair, and his wife died, and he's looking for the reincarnation of his wife. Well, that's not the Dracula story at all.
No.
That's the Barnabas Collins story, right? Except without Wallachia, with New England as the setting instead.
Yep.
And the sympathy generated by Barnabas has bled over into other vampires until we get to the point nowadays where there's the whole Twilight series that, vampires are they're nice guys.
Yeah.
It's vampires are the bad guys. I totally believe vampires are bad.
Being hoisted on a pike is a good thing, then I guess they're the good guys, right? But that's not the original story at all.
What I find interesting about that is that is the morphing of a mythology being played out before our very eyes. Like Joseph Campbell always talks about how you need to update your mythology, and the way that you would do that is through the eyes of the artists, since they're your direct metaphysical connection to that sort of thing of mythology. So it's interesting to watch artists play with myth like that and create what is essentially a new paradigm myth.
Right.
To be enjoyed, that updates it to modern times, that makes it, it keeps things like the vampire in context.
Makes
with
it relevant.
Who we are, yeah.
Right, in the same way that George Romero, when he took his ghouls for Night of the Living Dead, which were not called zombies at the time, but that became the new zombie paradigm, and people barely even remember the I walked with a zombie, traditional, white zombie kind of zombies anymore.
Yeah.
When people say zombies, they don't think of a whole bunch of plantation workers out there doing the fields and grinding the mills and that kind of stuff. Now they think about people that want to eat your flesh, and that's all George Romero.
Yep. Brains.
I never knew that. I didn't realize
I'm old enough now to have watched all of this.
So the entire modern interpretation of zombies is all because of George Romero, is what you're saying,
right? Yeah, as near as I can determine.
Okay.
Before he turned it on its head back in, when was that, 1969-ish? Before he did that, the flesh-eating zombies that we know now didn't exist. And then when Return of the Living Dead came along, which is a very funny, cool pseudo-sequel, that cemented it. Then you had the zombies that said, brains, and everyone latched onto that. And then
because the slow zombies are the original. Those are the original zombies, right? The slow ones. It's not
what they now call slow zombies.
Yeah,
but they were basically, zombies were traditionally, they were slaves. They were people that you'd killed and or drugged, depending upon whether you believe in supernatural and non-supernatural.
Like in Serpent in the Rainbow.
Right, which is actually a movie I haven't seen all of. I need to go and get that off my shelf and watch it.
Oh yeah, it's really good. It's really good. Apparently,
Twisted.
The guy who wrote the novel, I'm not sure. Somebody associated with that novel is from our university. I seen it in I work at the library there, and I seen it in the shelf. We have like a special shelf for people who have wrote books who graduated from there. And it says
cool.
Serpent in the Rainbow, so maybe an editor or perhaps the writer. I don't know. I'll have to look into it.
Cool.
And there he is,
see?
the gray wizard.
No, see, I digress too. I randomize variables too, just like nature.
So over time, just if you're still kind of tracing my evolution, I moved from fantasy and horror in the 1970s. I branched out into science fiction and true fantasy. Got completely hooked on to Tolkien, like everyone my age. And then that was what I was into for a long while. I was still interested in monsters and science fiction, but Tolkien and fantasy were it to me. In fact, they were so much it to me that I refused to play Dungeons and Dragons for 2 or 3 years. I had friends that were playing it, I think literally from 1974 or 5, right when it started. And I watched them do it and attended a couple of gaming sessions. They were like, hey, you want to do this with us? And I was like, oh, no, that's just bastard Tolkien stuff.
Yeah, it seemed like a derivative, right?
You were a purist.
Yeah.
Is that what it was?
I was a Tolkien purist.
Yeah. You felt it was being somehow adulterated in the game. Yeah, it was a total.
Right, exactly.
Adulterated would be the wrong word.
Or at least a derivative that you didn't want to waste your time with when you had the pure stuff.
I mean,
I was a Tolkien purist for a couple of years. And then I met a girl who was into Tolkien, who was the sister of a dungeon master, and that lies the beginning of the
end. It's always the same thing.
It encroached too close to you, and you got sucked in. So.
Yep. Yeah, I started dating her, and I started running D&D pretty much at the same time.
Well, I'm looking at a factoid here, right? I think, is that on here? Something about MIT? You ran one of the first games at MIT?
I actually, with my friend Marty Serkin, who's going to probably be at the Super Bowl tomorrow, or at least his family is, because he still has Patriots tickets. Marty and I were, so far as anyone knows, and certainly as far as I know, the first people to ever teach D&D at a university.
So you were teaching.
We taught it at MIT. We taught D&D to people because
it was a class.
We were teaching it was a class. Yeah.
How the hell did you?
How many credits?
Yeah. Okay. Right. You can't just run away from that.
You have to let me finish.
Okay. Can you come to here? Can you come here and run it, please? I could use a few extra credits at the. I got one more semester.
I'm thinking I'm old enough now that if I need to fall back and figure out something I can do in my old age, maybe I'll start running D&D games again. But the classes were at what MIT called the High School Studies program, and it was kind of a gifted high school students programs that they ran on Saturday mornings. And Marty and I would we designed and taught a class on how to play D&D and stuff like that in that time slot at MIT, which was pretty cool. And I think it's, again, we weren't teaching MIT students per se, but we were teaching at MIT for MIT.
It's still very cool.
To high school students for D&D.
Yeah, I know a lot of people can say that A, they've taught a class in a role-playing game, or B, that they did it at MIT.
Right, yeah. And this was, I think it was 78. I'd have to go back. I probably still have my ID, my MIT ID somewhere. I think it was about 78, somewhere in that 78, 79.
That's a really interesting school, huh?
Oh yeah, MIT is a great place.
So what?
Place. It was. We used to digress a little more.
No, please.
This was back. The MIT had a building on one of the far edges of the campus called the Artificial Intelligence Lab, and my friend Marty, who was one of the original computer kids, I just didn't quite. I could have been, but I chose to look elsewhere.
Yep.
But he was heavy into computers, made a lot of money in computers later in life. But at the time, he used to work at the AI lab and hang out at the AI lab, even though I don't remember if he'd even graduated from high school at that. It's like a year younger than me. In the AI lab, they had Zork, which was the original
I remember
adventure.
Zork.
Text-based
game. Everyone remembers there was a game called Adventure, and there was a game called, and then Zork was, I think, the outgrowth of that. And in order to play Zork at MIT, you had to go there in the middle of the night because
to get the computer time,
game that you could now play on your phone literally took enough computing power that only 4 people, I think, 3 or 4 people could play it on the entire mainframe computer at MIT without tying up the whole computer. So you couldn't play it during the day. So we would go up to MIT the night before, go to the AI lab, play Zork all night, wired on Coca-Cola and Oreos, and then teach D&D the next morning.
That's awesome. That's
the thing.
That's a great prep for class. Yeah, that's a great prep for class, too. Like, it really gets you in the mood.
It was also creepy, though, because the floor right below the AI lab was entirely occupied by the CIA.
Oh.
And their job, when I never saw them, but everyone knew they were there, and their entire job was to spy on the AI lab to see what they were doing.
Wow.
You're kidding.
So
I didn't know.
It's the 70s, man.
Yeah.
Wow.
Shit going on.
And wasn't it the CIA that raided Steve Jackson's games?
I think it was probably the FBI.
Yeah, that would make a lot more sense, right? Okay. Unless he was like running the game in Kabul or something.
No, what it was is they were working on a supplement for cyberware and hacking, and they thought it was potentially a real document. Yeah,
they thought it was real, and they actually, I think it was the FBI, but this happened just before I got there. They actually raided TSR-2 because of a top secret game module.
Oh, yeah.
Was in development, and somehow and it would involve terrorists and all this kind of crap. And somehow the government, whether, I think it was the FBI, but I could be wrong, because like I said, it happened not too long before I started there. They actually ended up coming to TSR and kind of raiding the place and talking to the designers and that kind of stuff. It was like, okay, what's this terrorist plot you guys were involved in? We're like, oh no, wait, game, time out.
I can see somebody coming in and saying, well, we've got some interested parties that want to learn how to play this game.
Right.
You know what's
okay?
Yeah, I don't remember if it was an assassination of the president or what the game thing was. Merle Rasmussen could probably tell you.
Yeah,
but it was one of these. Oh no, we are not involved in that at all.
This happened in California. I think it's in California. There was a company out there that was designing and had released like a Call of Duty style video game.
Mm-hmm.
And in there, I think it was on their like second floor. They had a mannequin that was wearing all of the combat gear that you would have in the game. Okay. So this mannequin thing was close to the window. of this place, and someone going by saw it, and I think it happened on a weekend or something, called the police, and this mannequin had like a 6-hour standoff with the SWAT team in Los Angeles.
Stonewalled, man.
Just standing there, like, I had this whole standoff, and it was a mannequin. It wasn't like there was not even anybody there, kind of thing.
Our tax dollars at work.
Raided the third floor TSR one day because there was being collectors of all things like this. There were toys around, and one of them was a plastic machine gun. It may have been an AR-15 or something like that, and it was up on the third floor. And it's unclear to this day whether the person holding it actually pointed it out the window or whether it was just moving by the window with this plastic automatic weapon. In the days before you had little orange plugs at the end of the barrel. And the cops came right to the building they were looking for a sniper up on the third floor.
Right.
No, we're just game designers and artists, man. You have to put up with this stuff.
It's weird. It's funny because I've heard it, because in this time, you guys were sort of, in a sense, were writing your own rules.
Yes.
Both literally and figuratively, right? Because obviously you were designing this game, but this genre didn't exist. So you were sort of creating. Everybody was sort of making it up as they go along, right? And
yes.
and you hear about stories like this with rock and roll music. Like I heard what's his name, the lead singer for the Who, Roger Daltrey.
Roger Daltrey.
Okay, he said that, because they asked him, so what the hell were you guys doing? Because they were like hucking TVs out windows and stuff and doing all this stuff. And he goes, well, we didn't know what we were doing, but our managers didn't know we didn't know what we were doing. Like nobody knew what the hell they were doing. So they were just kind of making it up as they went along, right? And obviously that they ran square into law enforcement. And right, obviously Elvis did it. Everybody runs the Doors. Bam, they run right smack into the face of law enforcement every time because they're defining a genre. And it's interesting now to hear these stories because I never knew about this kind of stuff. But that you guys were kind of creating your own genre too at the same time. So inevitably, sooner or later, you're going to run it. You're going to run right square into law enforcement, and you're going to run right square into some religion somewhere too. Sooner or later,
you're taking freedom too seriously. You're having too much fun. Yeah. You have to cut your fun rations in half. I'm sorry.
I mean, shit. That should be a benchmark now. If hey, you're doing something. If
if someone gets upset at you and wants to close you down, you're probably doing something right.
Right. Yeah.
Unless you're actually out hurting people, which. D&D never really hurt anybody, so far as I know. It was a very social game, and in fact, now it's even being prescribed as therapy for people that need to get out and away from their phones and stuff. Go play D&D, play a board game, interact.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, there's a big...
And it was always that way, but back when we were doing it, as you said, there weren't any rules and there weren't any precedents, and we were just making it up as we were going, and we were looking to entertain ourselves. And we figured if we were entertaining ourselves, then we would entertain other people too.
Yes.
And when I went there, one of my personal goals, and I started at TSR as an editor, and then I moved into the art department and became a graphic artist and mapper. But when I went there, one of my goals, personal goals that I don't even remember if I shared with Lawrence or anybody else at the time, was to make D&D accessible to people, to make it so that you could understand how to play it out of the box.
Yeah.
And through a happy configuration of things and conflagration, the way things came together, there were a bunch of people that had that same goal right at the same time. And they seem to have hired us all. And, people like me and Harold Johnson and Frank Mensner and Steve Winter and John Pickens and Ed Sollers, all kind of, and the designers like Zeb and Tom, and everyone was kind of working in the same direction. And that allowed us to do the basic and expert sets, which I was one of the editors on, and fed the fire for the boom even more, which then brought the Satanic Panic backlash, which was honestly more about the people stirring it up, making money, than it was about anything else.
Yeah.
And sadly something that continues to this day.
The Christian religion and used that game to validate themselves. They said that it was real and that it had real power and it was the devil's work. And as long as anybody believed that, there was a reason for those people to flee that and come to the church. And the church was in decline at that time as far as younger people attending church and stuff, and it's still happening today. But, they really used it to validate their own position. If they could make D&D real, then they're real.
Not all the Christian church, certainly.
No. But the people capitalizing on it.
But a lot of the more fundamentalist evangelical churches, I'm sure that some of them saw it then and probably still see it now as an evil to be opposed. But for a lot of those people, it was a fundraiser. It was a big fundraiser.
Yeah, agreed.
And the more they could drum it up, the more the better it got. It was, and unfortunately, people were worried about it at the management level of the company at TSR in the early '80s. It was the people those of us that were doing the work were laughing at it. We thought it was absurd. It was hilarious. Yep. We knew that none of us were Satanists, despite the pie chart on the wall.
Right. But it's
okay.
We had, I think it was Jim Ward was talking to us about this, and I guess because it wasn't he the one that said, "Well, we'll just change the names." Yeah. And he said, and that was like that just stole their thunder. Yeah. Because anything beyond that then had to be implied.
Well, I mean, that sets up what I was saying about legitimizing their side of that, people that were capitalizing on it. As soon as you take the power away from them to say that it's real and thus validate themselves, then they have no more use for it.
And they just move on to something else.
Yep.
Right. And then, and they went from that to the satanic daycares and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And did you know those people were eventually completely exonerated of that?
Yeah.
Yes.
I just found that out not too long ago.
The McMartin daycare people, I think.
Oh my God, those poor people.
Right.
Gee,
right. Well, and James Dallas Egbert was never playing D&D in the tunnels at all.
Nope.
I mean, and last I heard, what we had heard at TSR at the end of the thing, which was maybe inside info, was that he was a gay man that was struggling and, was trying to deal with a sexuality that wasn't very acceptable at the time.
I believe he was found with his
thing. Yeah,
I believe he was found with his father at the end. That he had went and to his father's house in the end. I think.
Possibly. What we had heard was that he was with a lover somewhere.
Oh.
So but that's 30 years ago. I'm not even sure if he's still.
And like you said, you guys may have heard the real deal and said, well, we ain't going to say that.
But kind of to what you're getting. Kind of to your point, though, right? This thing just keeps evolving because it was backmasking at one point, and then it was. I mean, I don't even know what it is today. I'm sure it's something.
Judas Priest went to court over backmasking. I mean, again, there's that face where you don't really know, like that dude.
Like, why am I here?
Yeah, like what's going on? Like, how did I go wrong? Right. What'd I do? Why is everybody so serious, man?
The 60 Minutes interview, which is probably what you saw. With Gary and Dieter, it was kind of it was a cold cock, They did a hatchet job on TSR and D&D, and none of us.
They probably thought it was going to be a promotional piece, and then bam, they get like jumped.
Right. Well, and it's satanic panic, and the crazy thing was, and this has made me distrust news magazines especially, but all corporate news media since, was that they basically concluded, well, maybe there is something here. Maybe there is something evil.
Well, at that time,
it was only in the letters that they had someone write a letter the following week that they read that was like, "What are you, crazy? You just jumped to a conclusion that your facts don't support." And it's like, I'm sorry, I work here. I didn't know Gary really well then, but I knew a lot of the people involved, and I still know Dieter Sturm, and none of us would have been involved with this if it was evil.
Right. Well,
most of the people I know that worked in TSR have a strong moral core, and right at the center of it is don't be evil.
Yeah. I mean, I think Gary was a Jehovah's Witness, if I understand correctly. Right. At that same time that 60 Minutes interview came out, and prior to that, you had Patricia pulling, going around the country, being on talk shows and stopping at local law enforcement offices and giving them lectures and pamphlets on how to spot satanic activity, and because she formed MAD, Mothers Against D&D. So, she was obviously connected with that 60 Minutes interview prior to what you described as being kind of ambushed when they arrived over.
It was a hatchet job. It was really ambush journalism at its finest.
Yeah, definitely so. Yep. Well, yeah.
Yeah, and there were people like her, and I'm not saying that was the only reason she was doing it, made a good living off of trying to portray us all, those of us that were there and those of us that were playing the games, as things we were not and never were. Yeah. Never were. The number of really wacky people doing D&D is probably less than the number of really wacky people in general life.
Yeah. That's what Jim told us. And overnight they went from being in JCPenney's and some other boom.
Yeah.
He said he was like millions of dollars in annual revenue. Poof, gone.
Yeah.
Because of this.
Yeah, it was really difficult. And then, then there was the conflict between Jim was kind of in between the creatives and the management. He didn't work with us downtown. The pull between management, which was like, God, we're having trouble with this. You guys better scale back. And us who was like, screw it. The more they want to burn, the more we'll make. that was a real friction there.
Yeah. Well, that's the artist backlash
of the early 80s.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the downtown, the creative division theory on it was screw it. It was Dr. Don Snow, who I think was in marketing, said at one point, one of my favorite things anyone ever said at TSR, when told that people were buying the books to burn them, Don said, if they'd come to me, I'd have given them to them wholesale.
Right, I'd given them a discount. That's
burn all you want, we'll
make more.
I think it was Nikki Sixx from Motley Crue, and they said, hey, they're going to put this explicit lyrics label on the album, and he went, put it on the front, make it huge, stick it right on there. He's like, what are they, crazy? We'll sell, and he was right. He was like, yep, there's something naughty about this. Boom, there it went.
Yeah, well, it probably did boost up the profile too, but it also created enough backlash that it hurt the company in ways.
It certainly did. Yeah, it certainly did.
Covered from some ways.
Stephen, have you heard any of the backmasking from that time era, from the early 80s to the mid 80s?
No, not really. I aside from the Beatles, I haven't delved at all into that really. But it's having been in the creative industries for so long, people goof around and do stuff just to do it.
Well, sure.
It's like there's a guy who's was on Top Gear, and he's on the Grand Tour now on Amazon, which is Car Show, where he wrote a whole article where the first letter of every sentence spelled out like a "screw you" publisher message or something.
Oh, you're talking about Jeremy Clarkson, aren't you?
No, it's actually James May.
It was James May that did it? Yeah. I love those guys. I'm a huge geeky fan.
We love them too.
Oh.
My wife and I are big fans.
I could go on for hours.
Well, I mean, I know some of these artists didn't intend to have these things in their songs, but if you get time, go on YouTube and type in Another One Bites the Dust Backwards. And that's a great, it'll give you a great idea of people who were using backwards content in their music, like the piano strikes are backwards in the normal version, but of course when you flip it over, you hear them normal. But then listen to what's being sang, because that's one of the main ones that people targeted onto, and it sounds like they're saying start to smoke marijuana. and it really does.
Because of the backmasking.
There's a phenomenon, I think it's called pareidolia, but I could be wrong because I don't talk about it a lot, in which humans are trained to recognize patterns, and especially faces. So people see faces in all sorts of things, like Jesus in your piece of French toast, right? Yeah. And the same applies to sounds and stuff. And a lot of the stuff you hear in that kind of stuff is it's just coincidence, but people will pick it out and hear it and think it's deliberate.
Yep.
And, maybe you can say, oh, it's subconscious. We all know when we speak, we know what it's going to be backwards, and we put hidden subliminal messages in there subconsciously. But at that point, if no one knows they're doing it, it's silly.
It is. But you know what? What makes me laugh is when I think of the very first religious person who had a record player and they were looking at it and they were wondering and they started playing it backwards and they thought they heard something. I mean, how silly and absurd is it that person got scared of their record player right then and there?
Look, there is a conspiracy theory that it was put in, and then the record companies were the ones that released the information that there was backmasking in records. And the thought was so that people would do that, Eric, that they would play these records backwards, destroying them, and they would get, just by adding this little sound piece in there, they would get, 3% more record sales of this particular album because on at least one of the tracks there's backmasking.
And some people got scared, and some people
just to see.
Yeah.
People pick it up just to find out. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of D&D sales were that way too at the time. It's like, oh my God, people saying it's got sex and it's got violence and it's got all this stuff that it didn't have a lot of any more than life had, certainly.
Yeah.
They'll pick it up just to find out. And
I don't know.
I'll admit I'm that kind of person today. If I hear, oh, this scandalous thing, I'll go, okay, let's see what this is about.
Yeah, you just sold one to me, whatever it was. If it's scandalous and somebody in authority says I shouldn't have it, I want two.
Right. Well, exactly.
What was
Tell me I can't have it, and I almost immediately want one.
Yeah, at least one. I want two in case one breaks.
Right.
Okay.
One I can carry with me and show other people and keep one at home.
Right.
What science fiction got you hooked? I mean, what you were saying that you got into, what you said was called true fantasy, which I'm thinking what you mean is like, well, what I'm interpreting that as is like epic fantasy as opposed to sword and sorcery, right?
Right. Actually, I got into sword and sorcery around the same time. I was into high fantasy in the kind of Tolkien tradition, but it's funny, thinking about it, the stuff that I read that wasn't Tolkien was things like Robert E. Howard, a huge fan of Robert E. Howard. He was a brilliant writer. And then that, you can't get into Howard without getting into Lovecraft or the other way around. And I don't remember which led me to which. So Lovecraft and Howard. In science fiction, I was a huge Heinlein fan. Read a lot of Heinlein books. Some Asimov, some Arthur C. Clarke, but a lot of Heinlein books.
Wow.
And he remains. Stranger in the Strange Land is one of my favorite books. It's right up there with Lord of the Rings.
The era of I Grok Spock.
I Grok Spock, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay,
exactly.
that's esoteric.
I used to have a T-shirt that said Grok on it. So
yeah.
Okay.
And then I would wear it places and forget I had it on, and people would go, "Oh, I Grok Spock," and I'm like, "Yeah, okay, me too." Like, why did they say that to me? And I was like, "Oh, I'm walking around with a T-shirt that has a big Grok."
Okay, me too, weirdo. So, all right.
How did they know this about me?
So what exactly?
They grok you.
What the hell does I Grok Spock mean? I know you've explained this to me before, but I can't remember what it was. What does that mean?
Grok from Stranger in a Strange Land. It is a Martian word. It literally means to eat, but basically it means to understand something so much that it becomes part of you.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. You not
read
only
the book. It's a great book. I need to reread it.
Yeah, definitely. It's great. Yeah. You not only understand where a person's coming from, but you also understand why they're coming from that direction. You understand them like you understand yourself and their motives and stuff, and you can appreciate their own insecurities and self-defenses, which is hard to do even empathically with people who are empathic,
Yeah, it's a very Buddhist kind of thing, actually. It's a lot about compassion and empathy. So.
Yeah, it's very beautiful.
So I got to get. One of the things I was watching today before the interview, Stephen, was you were talking on a podcast, or you were on either that or you're on a Skype call or something, and you were going into detail about work about grit and work and just sort of what it takes to get something published. And I think Eric told me this, you have somewhere around 30 plus novels that have been published.
My total number of books now, including anthologies and collections, is somewhere around 80, I think now. And the novels are probably close to 40 or 50. Oh. And I didn't set out to make big numbers, but there was a point where I was earning a lot of my income writing novels, detective novels. I wrote for a very famous boy detective series for a while until that company was bought up by a big company that then threw everyone out of work. I'd probably still be writing those today if that hadn't happened. So that gave me, I had 14 in that series, which is quite a few. And but basically everyone you meet, if you're a writer, if you're an author, and you've had a number of works published, everyone you meet at a convention is likely to come up to you and say, I have this great idea for a book, or I have a great idea for a story. And those of us that do this for a living have taken to saying to these people, well, then write it. Because the thing that distinguishes an author from people that are not authors is that the author actually does the work.
Yep.
In order to get published, what's the secret to get published? Well, first you have to write something. And whether that's a short story or whether it's a novel, you have to actually do it before you can actually become that then. I mean, sometimes when you're following a life path like I did, you move from gaming into comics into novels, and it kind of all flows a little. But in order to get any of those writing jobs, writing books, I actually had to write a book. And I wrote a draft of a book that has never been published. But that allowed me to show that for the Boy Detective series to someone that I heard through the grapevine that they were looking for people. I said, here's something I've written. And they said, okay, if you can do this, you can probably do what we're doing. And then you get to write more. But I still probably have, I don't know. Well, I've got 6 Frost Arrow novels that are unpublished and 2 fantasy novels, 3 if you count the one that I wrote for TSR Hasbro that they never published and the rights reverted. So I have a lot of unpublished books.
Man, but still, it's prolific, though. Like, that's a lot of writing.
Yeah.
It reminds me of
the trick to writing is so the first trick is that you have to actually do the work. The second trick to writing is ass in the chair. You have to sit down and do the work.
Yeah.
And there's no shortcut to it.
Right.
You just have to do it. And sometimes you're facing a blank page, and that's terrifying. Hopefully there are tips I can give you. You should keep a notebook, keep a commonplace book or some kind of set of notebooks, or keep notebooks plus I use the Google online service a lot to keep notes on too. So using Google, the name for it is just flashed right out of my head, even though I use it constantly. It's not Google Word, but the
Google Drive?
Google Docs. That's what it is.
Oh, right.
Use Google Docs to do that because you can take that across platforms.
Yep.
I have notebooks. I have yellow legal pads. I have Google Docs. Write all that stuff down because that gives you grist for the mill that you can use later.
Yeah.
But you actually have to, at some point, it's going to be you and a keyboard, or you and a typewriter, or you and a yellow pad if you're, really old-fashioned. And you're going to have to actually sit down and do it. And the only way to do that is to do it.
Yep.
And if you can set aside a certain time every day that you're going to write for an hour every day, or 2 hours, or 3 hours, or even 30 minutes, whatever it takes, you have to do it. That's the only way to get better at it too, is to do it, and then you want to have people that can critique it, that know something about what they're talking about. Because hopefully you're not in this just to spew out the words. Hopefully you're in it to get better as you go.
Yeah.
And that's a lifelong process. I hope and think that I'm a better writer now than when I started writing novels 20 years ago. And that's one of the reasons those unpublished novels remain unpublished, because part of me wants to go back and rewrite them.
Right.
Yeah.
Before I show them to anyone. So I'm now starting to think that's a futile pursuit, and I should just, if they're any good, I should put them out there and just say, hey, I wrote this 20 years ago. Check it out. Maybe you'll see what I liked doing in it. So.
Yeah. And I think the stories would still be valid. The ideas are probably still just as good as they were. Maybe your prose has improved and how you deliver that or something, but I bet that the kernel of the idea would still be appealing to people who like your idea modes.
Right.
Yes, and that's very true. And I'm finally shifting around to that. I started literally 20 years ago now. I was writing a series of horror novels that I intended to release one a month, like Goosebumps was being released at the time, but these were horror novels in the Dark Shadows vein for adults. And I actually wrote 6 of those. This was right around the time that Stephen King, it was right before he started doing the serialized novels that he did. So the time was really right for it, and the agent I had at the time totally failed to sell it. And so they ended up sitting on the shelf. And I'd planned 3 years of 3 years of stories for this, so like 36 books.
Wow.
So, and finished 6. So there's a lot of material still there that I'd like to get back to if I can ever find enough free time to do it.
Now,
so
you're currently working on Dr. Cushing books, correct?
Right, yeah. They're currently serialized on my website and on my Patreon, which I'll send the stuff to you as it comes out, which is CushingHorrors.com, is Dr. Cushing's Chamber of Horrors, and it is a classic Monster Rally novel told in serial form, and it's going to be a full novel length. It's somewhere around 90,000, 100,000 words or more at this point.
Nice.
And the draft is done, so it will be completed. It's not going to just spin out into nothing. I never start showing people stuff that I don't intend to finish, and so far managed to do it. And the let's see if I can remember the elevator pitch. I'm really bad at elevator pitching and selling myself. I'm really good at like writing and doing all this stuff. I'm crap at promotion. The elevator pitch is a vampire and a mummy battle over an eccentric family business that just happens to employ a werewolf in Dr. Cushing's Chamber of Horrors.
Awesome.
And it's all high points.
Yeah.
Right?
That's great.
That should tell you everything to know that you need to know whether you're interested in this.
Yes. Now, are you doing something, like I was reading on that site that you mentioned, are you doing something on Super Bowl Sunday that's involved with the writing, or did I misread that?
No, I think you misread that. I think you probably saw the Tournament of Death stuff, which was connected to the Olympics.
Okay, and yes.
For 4 consecutive, well, actually, I might have missed one. Yeah, I did because I had a day job. During 4 consecutive previous Olympics, during the Olympics, live during the 16, 17 days of the Olympics, I wrote a novel live online.
I thought that
every
was
day,
cool. I really did.
Every day I wrote a new chapter during the day, edited during the day and evening, and then published it sometimes at 3 or 4 in the morning.
And you allowed people to also, who contacted you during this, to either ask questions or slightly influence things, right?
Right, yeah. The last couple that I did, I ran them as Kickstarter campaigns.
Almost like a crowdsource kind of thing, yeah?
Yeah, and so people had pledged to the thing, and if you pledged to the thing, you got access to a chat group in which you could talk about what you liked and what you didn't like, and a lot of what people said would influence the way the storyline would go. It's like I had, with most things I do, I have kind of a beginning and an end spot, and the middle kind of develops as it goes. And traditionally, I outline a lot, and if you're struggling with your writing, go back to outlining. But the Tournament of Death, the 4 novels, and it's complete now. And the 4th one I hope to have released in ebook and paperback sometime in the next couple of months, certainly by the middle of 2018. But so the middle is always a little hazy, and I would sit and I'd watch the Olympics, and things that happened in the Olympic Games would end up being reflected in the story. So you'd have, for instance, there was a year when Bob Costas had some kind of an eye infection that was ongoing.
I remember that. He had pink eye.
And he couldn't, he was having trouble broadcasting, and I had an Orcish character, Genret character, that named Costas, who's got his eye poked out during one of the events. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. And there was during the Russian Olympics, I kind of took on the current president of Russia in a roundabout way as an evil sponsor of the games that was trying to do bad things and nefarious things. And the last one, I had an orange-haired dwarf that was building the best stuff ever. It's building the most amazing buildings and towers. You're going to love my tower. Everyone should come and live in my tower when they compete in the games. So there's current events, and there's events that happened in the Olympics, and then there's stuff that the fans responded to that would change the way I would do things going forward. And
brilliant.
It was really interesting because the people that ended up being the heroes and the through characters throughout the whole series, in the first book, until we got really late into the first book, they were disposable. They were scrubs. I was going to kill them all.
Whoops.
By the time I got to the end of that first book, I'd kind of fallen for them, and the fans seemed to like them. And then it just kept going that way.
You know, that's like your characters in your own novels are going through the gladiatorial games, and you think someone's not doing so well, but the crowd might save them.
Right. Well, exactly.
Stephen,
exactly. That's exactly what happened. There were at least a couple of characters that it was like I was totally going to kill them, and the people that I was hearing from on the little chat groups that I'd set up for Tournament of Death, they were so into this character or this character. It was like, damn it.
Man, I think that's brilliant.
That guy, they're going to be really mad at me.
Well, you could absolutely do this live now, even live streaming if you wanted to, like even on YouTube. There's so many mediums now. What's the other one? Periscope, that you can do this live. We've looked into this. At what level we want to do our podcasts, right? So,
right.
This is brilliant. Yeah, I love it. But there's so many different ways now. You could just sort of live stream it.
It was also insanely hard.
All that, to try to maintain any kind of train of thought when you're getting bombarded.
And the thing is, the books get getting longer as I went on.
As you try to incorporate all these things.
It's 16 days. If I can write 2,000 words a day, that's 32,000 words. That's the size of a Nancy Drew or Hardy Boys book, right? I could do that, right? I could probably do that. But the first one, I think, ended up being 40,000 words. The second one was 50. The third one was 60. The last one was like 80,000 words in 16 days plus the closing ceremony. So 17 days.
Wow.
A complete novel written and delivered one chapter a day.
That's unique and it's brilliant. It sounds like it was probably the most fun you'd had, and it sounds fun. I don't know. It
was always fun, but it was incredibly exhausting too.
Wow.
And I'm really relieved wrapped up the story, and I don't have to do it again next week.
Wow,
this is interesting.
Yeah.
We talked to 2 weeks ago. We talked to Michael Dobson, and he kind of just gave us for me it was because I don't know what I'm talking about, right? But he kind of to me it felt like he gave us a master class on self-publication. And
Michael's brilliant. I love Michael. He's a great guy.
And he never said nothing about this one, but this is almost like a new, because we tend to go pretty deep with you guys on and at some point I would ask you this anyway, but how technology is affecting both the games themselves and the way that you do business today versus historically, because it seems to be that there's a lot of benefits today with having the internet and accessibility of information and all this, but there also seems to be some real detriment to what it's done to the business as a whole.
Yes.
Yeah. What's your take on
it? Is the ability to micro-publish and self-publish and print on demand and that kind of stuff is both the best thing that has ever happened to me and the worst. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me because now, since my wife has a good job, and I should point out this, don't give up your day job unless someone you're living with has a good job. Since my wife has a good job, I now get to write what I want all the time, which is awesome. So if I want to do an adaptation of Manos, the Hands of Fate, I can do that. If I want to write Daikaiju Attack about giant monsters in the 1960s, I can do that. I can write Dr. Cushing's Chamber of Horrors. And I don't have to worry about selling them, which was, honestly, to digress a little to come back to this, I got out of comics because I was tired of pitching, only to have someone say, you can't do a Tales of the Zombie because XYZ has reserved the zombie at Marvel. You can't do this character. Right. This happened to me again and again and again. And I've always, if I'd lived in New York or on the East Coast where I'd had direct access to the publishers, it would have been much easier, I think, to continue doing comics. But I got tired of doing comics not because I don't like comics, because I love doing comics. If you said to me, I'm going to give you some money, do a comic, I'd be, hallelujah, I love doing comics. Let me contact some of my artist friends. But I got so tired of having to do that pitch thing. And there was a point, again, it was about a little more than 20 years ago now, where I was on the edge of comics, and I'd done quite a few successful comics, but they'd stopped doing the color Teenage Mutant Ninja stuff that I was writing at Archie. I was writing for Mirage, but we were all working for Archie. So I'd stopped doing that, and I was pitching for Marvel and DC, where I had people until they started consolidating. There was one day where they literally fired everyone I knew at Marvel.
Wow.
It was a bad thing.
Wow.
It's a bad thing when you wake up, and it was, I was working for their Disney line, and suddenly, but through the Disney line, I knew some other people, but they closed the Disney line, they fired people I was working for, and they fired everyone connected to them, which was just like, oh, this is terrible. But I was in that treadmill where I was pitching stuff and then kept getting it turned down, not because it wasn't a good idea a lot of the time, but because someone else had dibs on the character that was already deeper in the system than I was.
Yep.
And at some point, right after I'd written my first Boy Detectives novel, I went through this process again, and I said to myself, and it took weeks, and a little light bulb went off, and I said to myself, in the time you just spent trying unsuccessfully to do this, you could have written a whole nother novel, a short novel. And I was like, aha.
Right.
I'm going to stop, and I'm going to start writing novels. So at that point, I started writing. Right around then, I did the Frost Harrow novels, which were they were supposed to be a new adult supernatural horror novel every month. That was the plan. And if someone wants to do that, they're there. Come to me. We'll work out terms. So I switched because it was just too hard to play that game. The trouble is that not too many years ago, it got that same way with novels, where there was consolidation, where Bertelsmann was buying up things. This is the point at which they bought up the Boy Detectives. They fired the editor that had been there more than 20 years. They replaced her with her assistant, who had little enough experience that she would say to me, can we do this? And I would say, yes, we can do this. We've done this before. Then they got rid of her and got someone else in. And at some point right around then, they got someone in that didn't care about anyone that had worked with them before, because that person was a social climber, and they were using that editorial position to aim for another editorial position they wanted. And literally said, at that point, they literally said to me, don't call me. I will call you if I have it. And then you're frozen out. Yep. Anyway, so that happened with books, too, largely because of the consolidation and the competition. And then ebooks came along at another level of competition. Yep. But at the same time, ebooks and print-on-demand books also freed everything up. So suddenly, because my wife is an assistant director at a library, we spent a lot of time advancing her career and it's a secure job. suddenly I can write what I want, and I don't have to look for publishers. If I feel strongly enough about it, and usually if I didn't, I wouldn't be writing it.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's happening in music too. It's the same exact
I created
thing.
my own micro-publishing company.
Yep.
To do my work. And I've actually published a number of other authors, too, that just don't fit in the traditional markets. Because the sad thing about traditional publishing right now is under the big corporations, in order to sell a book to one of these big corporations, if it's not something that's pre-sold, something they own, something like Iron Man, the junior novel, or I'm doing a series called Monster Academy for a Korean company that teaches people English. If it's not something like that that's pre-sold, you not only have to bring them a good book, and I'm not even sure they care it's good anymore. You have to bring them a platform. You have to tell them how they're going to sell the book, to whom they're going to sell the book. You have to develop the audience for the book yourself.
Wow.
Before you sell it to them, to which I and many of the people that I know say,
why?
Well, then what are you here for?
Yeah, yeah. Why do you need these people?
So they're only looking for slam dunks. That's about it.
Yes. Yes. Whereas before, they would look for promising things that they could nurture and grow into from seed to tree into something that bore fruit.
Yeah.
But that generally is not happening anymore, at least not in the same way. They're looking for the A-list. So Stephen King will always have new books. Joe Rowling will always have new books. Any one of your franchise players will always have new books. But the chances for those of us that are in the middle list or doing stuff that's maybe not quite so popular now, like giant monster books, there should be a huge demand for those, but there isn't.
Yes.
Well, everything
we're kind of left out in the cold.
It all goes in cycles, though, right? And
yes.
We've seen Godzilla movies in the theaters, giant robot movies in the theaters. So the genre is fighting to stay alive. King Kong, right?
Yeah.
And it may be alive in some areas, but not in novels. Is the other thing. Too,
yeah.
The King Kong Godzilla franchise is going to go pretty well, I think. The Universal Monsters franchise is struggling a little more. But if you want to see what it could have been like, you can read my books, which they're not copies, but they're homages in some ways, but with a kind of a more modern sensibility. The same way as The Tournament of Death, in some sense, is a classic fantasy novel, but in another sense, it's a very modern take on classic fantasy novels. And it has a very different attitude.
Yeah, it's updating the mythology again. You're updating mythology to be relevant.
Right. And one of the things that people get hung up on, especially in fantasy, is the language that is used in fantasy novels. To which I always say, well, Tolkien wasn't writing in Tolkienese. Tolkien was writing in the style of his day. So to demand that I or Jim Ward or Gene Raby or anyone else we know write like Tolkien, that's like saying you should write like Shakespeare. Shakespeare was not writing in some weird old dialect. He was writing the language of the streets in his day. Yeah. That's like people being outraged that Lin-Manuel Miranda, the guy that did Hamilton, had done. And I just fumbled his name. Sorry, dude. We love your work.
No worries.
I'm not going to be able to get it out of my head because I'm babbling here. But we love your work. The people that were outraged that he'd done a musical that was entirely kind of rap and hip-hop based. It's like, well, it's about time.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
And it's a brilliant musical. So stop fighting. Let people use the tools that they have available and let people be who they are. So when you read my fantasy novels, people talk like they do today. They don't talk like they do in the 1950s. Unless you're reading, my Canoe Cops versus the Mummy, which is set in the 1950s, in which case the people talk like the 1950s. But the narrative style is still totally modern.
My son just turned me on to this new medium because you were talking earlier about your illustrator friends, right? And where they're taking like it's a narrated graphic novel. So think of like a slideshow, but with voice actors. acting, and and then so people are doing this now, and then they take these and they put them on something like Patreon, and to support the production and all of that kind of stuff, and are growing these fan bases now, completely like under the radar. This is all, this is like, National Lampoon times 1,000, right? Because there's all kinds of stuff like that showing up over there now from art. I've seen some people's personal, like, artists. Boris Vallejo
I support
style.
a lot of artists and people like that on Patreon, people that are doing little animations and that kind of stuff. I support a number of folks, people doing podcasts that I support on Patreon. It's another one of these wonderful crowdsource, democratic with a small d, put the decisions in the hands of the people that are interested in it thing going on. Now, you asked about the downside. The downside to this lack of gatekeepers, to the fact that everything is available and anyone could do it, is that in the old days, before it became all about the slam dunks, you had people that were gatekeepers in the best sense, in that they would go amid all this coal and find the diamonds in the coal pile. And that is becoming increasingly difficult. Yeah. And it's, as someone who is crappy at publicity like I am, it's something that I struggle with. I'm doing really good work, but not a lot of people are seeing it because I don't have an advocate that is out there saying, hey, see Steve's new stuff. It's like Universal Horror meets Hammer, written by Stephen King. You'll like it.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of one of the goals of our show, is to have somebody on long enough to describe their feelings and philosophies behind why they're doing what they're doing, because there isn't, then you can drop this anywhere and people can have that understanding, and it's not anything that you have to manage or create or produce like an advertisement or anything. It's just you explaining who you are and why you do what you do and talking about your work. And hopefully that's the goal, is that people, when they listen to this, they're doing so because they have an interest in you as an artist, and hopefully establish a closer tie between who you are and what you do.
And I'm always willing to do this kind of stuff and talk to the fans and get feedback and engage. That's something I feel is completely worthwhile. It's the kind of, I'm old enough and I grew up in, kind of a New England family, and my wife's family from Wisconsin is the same way, where you don't blow your own horn.
Yeah.
It's crass. It's not something you should have to do. Your work should speak for itself.
Yep.
And for a long time, that was true, but now we're in a situation where people want you to be both the huckster and the creator. Yeah. And I know some creators that are really good at that, but a majority of us aren't. We're introverts, at least at some level. And if we wanted to be extroverts, we would have been extroverts, but we don't. I want to stay home. My goal is to stay in my house and produce art and writing that other people can enjoy.
Yes.
Things that I like to do myself, things that I like to read. So I love giant monsters. I wrote a giant monster book. I did the Manos book because I love Manos, and also because I thought maybe the people that enjoy Manos might enjoy some of my other stuff. Mm-hmm. And people know Manos. That was my lame attempt at publicity, but at least I won a major award for it.
Yeah.
I'm doing Dr. Cushing because Universal monster cycle has kind of sputtered. They're not quite sure what they want to do. I'm doing the kind of stuff I'd like to see them doing.
Right.
And I know there are a lot of people that feel that way.
Yeah.
And hopefully some of them are listening to your podcast.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the people who have been on have expressed these same concerns and relevant issues as it applies to their own situation. And, I think everybody agrees that we've had on the show that there's a need for the artist to have a direct connection with people in general.
With the real world.
Like directly, like through mediums like this, or through websites, or like how you were doing with writing that novel live and stuff, because the inverse of that is that there's some sort of an agenda or there's some sort of fence around you, like you pointed out, that's geared to keep you headed and into a situation that's going to provide trade and money. And that's not the spirit of an artist. I mean, you get to do what you want to do, and I bet your work is 10 times better because you get to do what you want to do than because someone's contracting you out to do what they want you to do.
Right. And I'm not saying that the Legend of the Five Rings books that I wrote, which, again, won another award, that those aren't any good.
No.
And they are good, and I try to put all my soul into everything that I create.
Well, yeah, there's things that people can...
But in some sense, there's more of me in Daikaiju Attack than there probably is in all of those detective books I wrote.
Oh.
And the same goes for the Tournament of Death. If you want to see what I think, what my soul says fantasy should be, read the Tournament of Death. If you want to see what my soul thinks giant monsters should be like, read Daikaiju Attack, which I might retitle because enough people have said the title's putting people off. They don't know what it means. Call it Giant Monster Attack. And it'll be fine. It's a Giant Monsters Attack book.
I don't know, man. All of my kids are huge anime fans and stuff like that. And it has its own cult following, if you will, that kind of stuff. So,
right, it's always a fine line, and like I said, marketing is my kryptonite. You know, if someone wants to take me on as a marketing project and not charge me any money up front, you can find me at sdsullivan.com.
That's what Michael Dobson was saying too, because there is a level at which the corporate entity becomes necessary because not everybody can do all of this stuff.
Right.
Not everybody can, there are, like you're saying, you're sort of validating that here by saying, some people just aren't real good at self-promotion. And then there's Kim Kardashian who can...
It's my kryptonite. I'm pretty good at podcasts.
Yeah.
Aside from podcasts, I suck.
But then there's people in this world like Kim Kardashian, who is famous for being famous. That's it. That's all that woman has ever done is be famous.
Right, she has no product
at all.
She sold the hell out of it.
Right. So it's like there's this weird. The internet gives you the technology gives you the ability at both extremes here, but everybody's on the same field now, and go.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully people can figure out what's gonna work for them and what's going to attract them. And podcasts like this and the Monster Kid Radio and the other podcasts that I do semi-regularly, that's part of it. But part of it is, the reason I do it is not for that. The reason I'm talking to you guys is not for promotion. It's to share and be part of this community, which is a community I love. And I've obviously grown up and grown somewhat old.
Yeah.
in this community. And I was a kid when I started. I was the second or third youngest person in all of the TSR creative division. I was older than Jeff D and Diesel and Paul Ritchie, I think, maybe. But so I was really young, and now I'm kind of one of the graybeards. But that's literally true, though. Jim Ward's more gray than I am. Frank Menster is more gray and has a much bigger beard. But I've been with this community for a long time, and honestly, working at TSR and working at Pacesetter afterwards, which was a subset of TSR, those were the communities where I really felt like I fit in, where I wasn't so much the square peg. And today, those communities exist in things like you guys and the Monster Kid community too. And I want to share and enjoy being part of that community, and that's why I do podcasts.
Yeah, we appreciate that too. We really do. We appreciate you bringing that past experience into this today and sharing that with us, because that's what makes the interesting conversation. The experiences that you have in life that lead up to what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Right. And you want to get me now because God knows I'm reaching the age where it's starting to
Stop.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
I thought we decided already that you were going to make it to 111, right?
Yeah.
Did we get that?
111. I'm a little more than halfway there.
Yeah. Did we get that? Was we recording then, or?
I don't think so.
Was that? Yeah. My goal is to lived to 11T1, the Hobbit age.
That's right.
From Tolkien. 111.
And then Eric,
that's my goal.
Eric turned into like a DNA expert and said something about unraveling tail end of something or others, and we all just sort of checked out.
We're talking about telomeres, the fact that if we're not careful, the only people who will be immortal will be the amoral rich, which is a real danger, I think.
Yeah,
so.
I think we did get that, actually, that part at least.
We're probably repeating ourselves.
Yeah, probably.
So, but I want to make sure that we talk about... if you wouldn't mind, because I saw it somewhere, it was either you or participate in some sort of paranormal writing group or something to that effect.
No, radio.
It was a radio.
I did
Uncanny Radio.
For a year. I did Uncanny Radio, which was a local show that I did with my friend Linda Godfrey, who is famous for weird Wisconsin books and all sorts of true supernatural kind of books, and is the original reporter that reported the Beast of Bray Road story, which happened in Elkhorn on Bray Road. There was a werewolf sighting in the 1980s. Not too far from where some of Jim Ward's family lives, I understand.
Okay.
No relation, but not too far.
Let's go back to that pie chart.
So that started her in a career in supernatural investigation. And there was a year until the weather got bad and we decided we couldn't continue anymore, where we did a radio show called Uncanny Radio from WBSD in Burlington. 42 shows, which is a nice number.
Yeah, it connects with everything.
42. And they're not currently available online, but they might be soon. And we basically talked to all sorts of interesting people about investigations of ghosts and Bigfoot and werewolves, and
that's cool.
And I talked to my friend, the Tolkien expert, on one of them, and Stan Brown, the cartoonist and TSR guy. We talked to a lot of interesting people, and some of them were true believers, and at least one of them was a hoaxer, as it turns out in the end, and it was really, we had a great time, and it was kind of during the heyday of the true supernatural TV shows that were going on, like what was the one with the? I'm not going to be able to. Ghost Hunters.
Ghost Hunters. Okay, yeah.
But there was the Destination Truth, and a number of these other shows that were kind of going on at that era, and we were trying to convince NPR or somebody that this would be a really cool thing to do nationally on an ongoing basis. Huh. Sadly, like my idea of doing serialized novels, it was an idea ahead of its time.
Yeah. I've seen this pop up. There's somebody in southeastern Ohio that's doing like the tales of the the spectral locomotive and the tunnels, and has all these haunted places, and they're doing like a whole series of stories. They're just sort of like narrated with pictures, but they're fascinating because I didn't know about.
Are they doing true stories, or are they doing?
Yeah. These are legitimate places and legitimate claims. These are the lore of that area, and it goes way down into like the coal mining areas and stuff like that of down into southeastern Ohio, and there's a very rich Appalachian tradition, because that's sort of your cutoff point, right? When you start getting into more like the mountainous regions there. But there's all these interesting heritage type stories that are they're all well known to the locals, but no one's really kind of put them down per se. So
that's cool.
So this guy's like going through and doing these this series where he actually goes to these places and then takes high res imaging, pictures of it, and puts like a real.
So it's like the Brothers Grimm, but in the digital age.
Yeah, but with legitimate folklore, and that guy's going to fool around. You watch, he's going to fool around here, and this is going to turn into something where he starts going around to other places and doing the same thing. It's going to become a thing for him, and it's just it's just a hobby. It looks like. It's just something that some guy's doing himself because it's something he's interested in right now.
Yeah, it's kind of a modern mythology and folklore is really interesting to me. When we were doing Uncanny Radio, I described Linda was Mulder, I was Scully, from before they did the kind of Mulder Scully switch that they did at the end of the X-Files.
Right. Yeah, because it's backwards now.
She was the I want to believe. I was the I'm a little dubious about this guy. But it was a really good dynamic, and we did a lot of interesting stuff in those 42 episodes. So I'm hoping that someone will be maybe reviving those and putting them up on iTunes soon, because it's not something I just don't have time to figure it out. But one of my podcasting friends has been talking about maybe creating his own little network, which would need new shows, and then I don't think we'd be doing new ones, but maybe we could get the ones that are there back into a place where they can all be heard. Some of them may still be accessible on Blog Talk Radio or something like that, but most of them are off in the ether right now, just waiting to return.
Isn't it amazing, though, just the sheer volume or catalog of information we all have access to today? With being able to look up old television shows or any, even local broadcast stuff, like kids shows from Boston are being archived and put up on YouTube.
Right.
I was going to ask you, Stephen, did you ever see a sci-fi kids episode called Space Giants?
I've heard of it, but I don't think I've ever seen it.
It has a kid named Gam, and his mother and father are both robots, and he is too, that turns into jet airplanes, Goldar, Silvar. It's very strange.
That's yes, I've heard of it, but that's actually from post my childhood. My childhood basically ran, I was born in 1959, so my childhood ended in the early 1970s, and I kind of missed that whole Transformer Voltron binge. That was when I was dating by then, so
he was interested in other things.
Giant robot, or I could go out with the girl.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. No worries.
He was studying anatomy at that point in time. So
yeah, exactly. Practical anatomy.
That's exactly applied anatomy. I'm sure.
And biology. Applied anatomy and biology.
All robots have an end.
So no, but I did see the original runs of weird things like Space Angel and Clutch Cargo and those kind of strange shows, as well as the way they have horror hosts still. They used to have kiddie show hosts locally, and we had Major Mudd, who was an astronaut, who used to the people would come out in costume or in persona, and then they'd introduce the little segments of cartoons and whatever else was going on and stuff. And that was kind of a lot of fun for my childhood. I think people miss that. The days of, 157 channels and nothing on now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The great thing is that so much is out there, and so much is available, and things that literally I spent probably the first 40 years of my life developing this huge research library in my household that now has been entirely supplanted by the internet almost.
Right. Like you don't even hardly need, do you reference it much anymore at all, or do you just automatically go to Google?
I go to Google a lot, though. Honestly, one of the things I keep returning to is that goofy astrology and other occult games book that I got in grade school. That has a great section on how to read tarot cards that I've actually been using.
Wow. And that witchcraft book too. If I need real historical witchcraft spells, that book is still around, and I can yank it out and look and see what the magic circles look like, and what the magic squares and all the other crazy stuff that's in that little book that they would in no way let near a school at all now. Never mind sell it to you on a monthly basis.
And you're building a career on it. I mean, basically, right? I mean, you've sort of, yeah, that's crazy.
Does that book talk about the Rider-Waite deck and a Celtic cross spread? Is that what it is? Does it have something different?
Yeah, actually, that's I think one of all the pictures of the Rider-Waite deck, and I think it has a short form and a long form, and I'm not sure the Celtic cross is one of them.
Okay.
And in the Cushing Horrors, I'm using the short form tarot, which is a 5-card read. So, but I just picked up another book on tarot too. So
I used to be a professional tarot card reader for 6 years on the psychic line. That's why I ask.
Cool. I have very mixed feelings about those kind of things. I think that Generally, I am not fond of psychic readings because I think there's way too much that involves just simply cold reading people, which is a technique that magicians and mentalists use.
I think Eric's about to become very controversial here and tell us.
I also believe that sometimes that using a deck or some other method to focus your concentration can allow you to see things in yourself and in other people
as a therapy.
Maybe you would not have seen without that deck.
Yeah, sure.
So how did you do it, Eric?
Well, we did it on a phone line in a cubicle.
Okay.
So
were you actually laying the cards out in the cubicle? Were you actually doing the readings?
Yeah, I had a Rider-Waite deck, and I did a Celtic cross spread, and I did readings that would be for the next 12 months, because after 12 months, the variables would be too many to read, and I would emphasize that you didn't that it's just a suggestion to the probable course of your life, that the whole reason why you're getting a reading is that you can make changes. And I would start shuffling the cards, and I would say, when you feel the time is right, let me know, and I'll stop shuffling. And then they would say, okay, now, and I'd stop, and then I would start reading the cards in a Celtic cross spread.
Oh, cool. It's cool that you were actually doing that. And one of the reasons I asked was because you never know with these kind of lines how much of it is sincere people working to try to sincerely help you, and how much is bullshit.
Yeah.
And I'm going to relate just a little story about this. When I was at TSR, there was a guy named Michael, and I'm spacing out his last name right now, who had come from New York. He was an editor in New York. He worked on a number of magazines. And one of the things he had done out there was he was one of the editors of True UFO magazine. Right, which was kind of a big deal back then. It was, that was early 80s, was one of the spikes in UFO sightings and stuff. So True UFO magazine was kind of a big deal. And one day I said to him, we were at TSR together, and I said to him, so Michael, all those true stories you had in True UFO magazine, how did you get those stories? How did you collect all those stories? He was like, oh, we made them up.
All of them, huh?
They made them up. They made them all up. They were doing the same thing that the Weekly World News was doing.
Yep. So,
and he said he had an I Feel Terrible story about a really sick kid who had written to him, who was, he was possibly a terminal kid, that had written and said, my mom keeps telling me I should believe in God, but I'd rather believe in UFOs because they'll take me up and heal me and I'll be better. And I don't remember what Michael might have written back to him, but it was like, oh, God, we're writing all this fake UFO stuff, and this kid is counting on us to save him from cancer.
Right.
Yeah. So you got to be wary of that.
I definitely understand. There was people that would sometimes sit beside me that would just be talking with people. They declared themselves as clairvoyants so that they didn't have to use any medium to work with for the divination process. And then literally I would hear them just saying crazy stuff to people, just telling them whatever they thought off the top of their head. And, 98% of the people that called in, every question was either about love or money. Okay. Right. So, like, does he love me? Is she cheating on me? Am I going to get this job? If it wasn't in that percentage, it was something truly bizarre. Right.
It's like, I saw this squirrel the other day on my grandfather's grave, and I think his spirit entered the squirrel, and he was trying to communicate with me.
Oh, I'm telling you, this one lady called me, and she said she had 12 kids, 11 of them were animals, and that each of them spoke a different dimensional language, and that she had a book filled full of holistic remedies that was written in 12 different languages of a dimensional quality, and that her kids were going to decipher this book, and that the book contained all these remedies and stuff, right? And she went on and on about this for a couple of calls, and then finally, because we could only take 3 calls, I'm like, well, ma'am, what is it that you want from me? And she says, well, I need to know what Merlin looks like. Me and him have both incarnated several times in several lifetimes, and I have no idea what he looks like. That was her question.
Okay.
Right? I know. Right? All right. Off we go.
So
seems oddly specific.
So like I said, well, sometimes this stuff can be helpful, and talking to anyone that's sympathetic and wise can be useful.
Yeah.
You have to be aware that there are people out there that are, how do you get those true UFO stories? I made them up. And, as an author, I appreciate that.
Right. But
as a skeptic and a scientist, I'm not too thrilled with it.
Right.
Yeah. And, most of these people, they really only needed the same kind of advice you would really give anybody in these same situations, And
that was the majority, right?
Yeah. It wasn't, there was no mystical quality to it. And in fact, even the cards would reflect as much. They would say, at some points halfway through a reading, I'd be like, well, are you looking for a job? No, I was just thinking about this. I heard this job or something, or they would say, it was strange. And then you would have this conversation where you would say, well, you need to go out and you need to apply to these places and not be feeling like you can't do this, and a lot of times it just turned into a psychological conversation about life.
And just giving them encouragement.
Yeah. And sometimes validation. They wanted to know that they wanted someone out there to know that they had these beliefs about psychics and stuff, and that they cared about the advice that psychics gave them, maybe more than their doctors or lawyers or family would give them.
Yeah.
Right.
Just because we validate something they believe in.
Well, which, brings you back to, in some ways, to kind of wrap this around into advice for writers. How do you get to become a writer? You sit down and you write. How do you get a job? You sit down and you look for jobs.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Everyone wants to tell a story. If you really want to tell a story,
you gotta
record it on somewhere.
Yeah.
Use, voice recording to put it on your computer, or sit down, put your ass in the chair. Ass in the chair. That's what really counts.
Yep.
Even when you don't want to. Oh, here's another bit of advice that's from me through Gene Raby, or the other way around. Gene and I both say this often. One of the tricks of being a writer and doing it consistently is you never park on the uphill slope. You always park on the downslope. And that means when you're writing, when you're going to have to pick it up again tomorrow, you don't stop when you run into a problem. You stop when the road ahead of you is all downhill and you can see where it's going. Because by the time you get down to the bottom of that next hill, when you hit the next hill and it's a problem again, you're going to have built up enough momentum to get up the next hill.
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's interesting.
Park on the downslope.
It's funny. I'm a big fan of Joe Rogan, who's a comedian and a podcaster. He's a really popular podcast, and to hear him talk about comedians, and it's not what it's sitting down at a computer for 4 hours a day at a whack and writing. And if you can't write, you write about something, is what he says. But you have to write. Yeah. You just have to do it. It's an applied.
It's the same thing when you're doing papers and researching papers and stuff. If you don't start off researching and get that going, papers write themselves. It's the research or story idea, I think, that you got to come up with, or at least for papers it is, you got to research. And then by the time you have all that information inside you, you can't hardly help but to have that cathartic release of writing it all out.
Right. And there's times when I literally write to get things out of my head so I can work on something else.
Yeah.
Because this one won't leave me alone. It's like my brain is too jammed up with this stuff, and I have to get this idea out so that the idea that's log jammed behind it, which is the one I need to get at, is actually accessible.
Maybe there's
and it pretty much always works. If you sit and you start, remember, everyone writes shitty first drafts. Everyone writes shitty first. But it's getting that first draft out that allows you to revise into a better second draft, a better third draft, and a better final, however many drafts that takes. Some of us, it might take 3 or 4. I just sent Jim Ward a story that I wrote for him in the Dragon Scale anthology that he's doing. I generally do 3 or 4 drafts for any. I had a friend, a late friend who died a year and a half ago, who was one of the best travel writers in the world. He wrote stories that he got paid as much for a 1,000-word story as I get paid for a 10,000-word story, right? He was really good, got to go to amazing places, stay in in hotel rooms that were bigger than my house and stuff. And he literally rewrote his pieces 40, 50, 60 times. Yeah. And they're only a couple of thousand words.
Wow.
Some of them is more than 100 times. Just finding the right word, the right phrase, the right transition.
The flow, the structure.
So it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But the trick is getting that first crappy draft down. And if you do enough writing, the first drafts do get better. My first drafts now are way better than they were 20 years ago. But there's still, even if I show someone my first draft, which I pretty much never do, they'll go, oh, this is pretty good. And then I'll look at it. And by the time I'm done with track changes, the whole page is red and deletions and all this kind of crap. Everyone writes crappy first draft. Get the first draft down, and then keep going.
Isn't this a thing though, where I think the thing that stops people from trying to be creative or try new creative things is that this sort of notion that it's not going to be accepted or people aren't going to like it or whatever. And the answer to that is, yeah, you're going to have a lot of that. And if your poor little feelings can't take it, then you probably don't want to get into being an artist, but you got to toughen up, because a lot of the first stuff you do is going to be shit. It's going to suck, and people are going to go, oh, that's nice.
It's the whole 10,000 hours thing, right? You have to do something 10,000 hours before you're any good at it. And that applies to writing and drawing and painting and all that kind of stuff, too. Now, I can, I'm a pretty good artist, but I could draw for another 100,000 hours, and I probably still would never be as good as Larry Elmore is.
Right.
But you can get to the edge of your own abilities through practice. And then you have to know where your failings are, what you can't do. I'm never going to be, I have a brother who's an award-winning poet. I'm never going to be as good in that genre as he is. I could practice now till doomsday, but my brain doesn't work that way. But on the other hand, he's not writing a full 70,000 word novel in 16 days either. So,
or the thing that really sucks is to become extremely proficient and very good at something does not mean at all that you're going to have any kind of success with that. You could be,
that's true.
This world is full of amazing musicians, but very few of them ever get any kind of, can even make a living doing it, so that you have to kind of accept that about it too. You could be the best at the most technical and writer, but if the story you're telling doesn't resonate, okay.
You're ahead of your time, behind your time, or anything else like that.
Right.
No, it's, I've said a couple of times recently that I've risen to the pinnacle of 3 separate industries only to ride them right down into the ground. So, I was at the top of the role-playing game industry. I was working at TSR and Pacesetter doing award-winning work, and that crashed. And I rode right back up to the top of the comics industry, and that was going great guns, and I was doing stuff for Disney and Marvel, and I had DC, and I had the Teenage Mutant Turtles, and then that crashed. And I managed to rise up near the top of the publishing industry, and I was, writing half the Boy Detective books that came out every year, and that was going great guns, and I had L5R and Dragonlance and all this stuff, and then that crashed.
Right.
So.
Yeah, but the important thing is you're showing that you're riding the crest of each of those waves as they crash upon people's consciousness, right? Like you're indelibly marked with waves of very cool and interesting things.
And for some reason, then you understand the public zeitgeist somehow, where you can kind of position yourself. But to your point,
I used to say that I live 20 minutes in the future, but I can't get anyone to pay attention to me until 30 minutes later. It's like when I wrote the Frost Harrow books were literally made for ebook publishing. They were literally, and they were on one of the first ebook publishing sites, but this was before Nook and before Kindle, and no one could read them.
Right.
And that, it's like, damn, if I'd spaced that out better, if I'd had if I'd been a little less far ahead of the curve,
yeah.
But it would have been my stuff coming out when Twilight did, and people would, who knows, maybe I'd be a lot richer than I am.
It's nice having this medium, Stephen, because when we talk to people that are as accomplished as you are, in most other mediums, that part of the story gets left out, right? You don't really, so it's nice to have that second piece of it. That your career could ebb and flow multiple times throughout a lifetime. Yeah, but
I mean, if you're lucky, it runs the way that someone like Margaret Weiss did. Margaret, I was there when they hired her at TSR. She got in right at the beginning of the book boom, and she wrote brilliant stuff. She's a wonderful lady. She rode that up to the top, and there she stays.
Yeah. Yeah.
She may not have books coming out as often as she used to, but she's still doing brilliant work and is beloved for it. But so many more of us are riding those ups and downs.
Yeah.
Getting the crests and curves. And I wish I could take all my fans from TSR and all my fans from comics and all my friends from novels and get them all to support Cushing Horrors.
You're right. Just, consolidate. That would be great.
It would be wonderful if it worked that way. But,
that's
the trick of doing art is just not to get into it for the ego trip, to be in it for doing the work.
Right. But it's good that in conversations like this that we get to see how multifaceted that you and other artists are, because a lot of people only know you for certain things.
From one genre.
Right.
And a lot of times they don't even care to look outside of that genre. But when you sit and listen to a conversation like this and you see there's actually a common denominator between the things that you produce, one thing leads to another, and people become interested in other things, perhaps things that they didn't know you were even associated with. Like, I'm really keen on listening to these Uncanny Radio casts, and I didn't know anything about it.
UncannyRadio.com is still up and running, but I'm not sure how many of the links still work, but you can at least get a glimpse of what it was like.
Well, one of them leads to a bizarre cow with Japanese writing.
Say what?
Really?
Yeah, if you go on your website where it's got the UFO picture that in the middle.
Oh.
If you click on that, it goes to a very strange website with an animated sort of looking cow face with Japanese writing. So that's the only one that I seen that didn't work. Like, everything else was fine, and I was, I just didn't have time to listen to it.
That's weird. Is that the little UFO that says Uncanny Radio?
Yeah, click that. Yeah. Click, it's really neat.
I created that logo, and I'm surprised it goes. I wonder, there was an associated website I had with it called Uncanny World, and I let that lapse. And maybe that's where it's going.
That's where it goes. It says Uncanny World above the cow. Not in the site, but in the...
God, I could have gotten those guys to buy the website from me. I just let it go.
It was so bizarre. I wasn't sure it wasn't planned. I was like, is this some kind of like cow mutilation thing?
Yeah, no, that used to be my URL. That used to be... my Linda Godfrey had the Uncanny Radio URL, and I had Uncanny World. And at some point, I took over Uncanny Radio and decided to let the other one lapse, because I've got like 40 different URLs. It's like, do I need 40 different URLs? No.
Jeez. Yeah.
A bunch of them are for these Frost Harrow books, because when I was writing them was at the start of the internet, and there's an episode that's entirely based on internet monsters. So, anyway, so that was one of the ones I let lapse, and I guess hopefully it's not going to just some horrible porn or virus site.
Yeah, I don't know what it is.
There's an interesting story. Our original name for this show was the No Shit Podcast. That was the URL we were trying to get, right? Uh-huh. And we waited 5 days and went to go grab it, and it had already been turned into a porn site. It was that fast. 5 days. So I shouldn't be saying this because I'm promoting this porn site. So that's how we ended up actually becoming the No Shit Cast, was because the No Shit Podcast got hijacked by some porn site.
I don't even want to think what that porn site's about.
Right. There's some, the MonsterKidRadio.net is .net because there's someone cyber squatting on the .com. Which is really annoying. I hate cyber spotters.
Right. So. That's kind of what I think ultimately it's really what happened to us was it was like, well, if you call this number or if you and they want to like negotiate with selling you the right. And it's funny because, as soon as you do that search for the URL name, you're on the clock, because somehow if somebody sees that search come up, I don't know how they're doing it, but it seems like they see that search come up. Because what you do is you keep going back and checking to make sure no one's taken the URL yet, right? And I'm saying don't ever do that. Do it once, and then do it the day you do it.
once and then pull the trigger if you want it. Yeah, no, that's how I ended up with 49 or 50 websites at one point.
Is that right?
So it was like, I'm gonna grab this before anyone else.
Grab the URLs before anybody else gets them.
And a lot of times that's worked out for me. It's been there. So. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you, like you said, you go there and you look and you think, do I need that one? And you don't pull the trigger on it. Next time you go back, it's gone.
It's funny though. It was like, how the hell did they come? Like the exact spelling and everything. Someone's monitoring web traffic somehow, and they're seeing that. That's got to be what it is. It's spooky.
Yeah.
Spooky.
Well, we've been going on for a couple of hours, I think, here now.
Yes, we have.
Which is amazing. So at some point I have to, it is my wife's birthday tomorrow, and I have to get back to my family.
Okay,
so
well, we can certainly
let you go.
for me? Well, I don't think anything else off the top of our head.
No, I mean, I was going to have you ask me about, or ask me. I was going to ask you about Chill, but we can save that for another time if you want.
The short form is that Chill was supposed to represent Hammer and Universal Horror.
Oh, okay.
In a setting from the modern world down to Victorian times, and it was not a slasher monster game. It was a counterpoint to Cthulhu, and it worked really well, and we had probably half female players, which I think is pretty unique at the time.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It was an egalitarian game, and we could talk more about that in the future, but I'm very proud of the first edition of Chill.
Okay.
It can be hard to find now.
Yeah, I was looking for it then, so. Well, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to do this, and we'll let you go. And
we had a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys. It was great.
Look forward to, if you want, when we'll do one specifically on Chill, like a separate podcast. That might be worth looking into, because it has a specific audience, You
never know how long things are going to last.
Right.
How long the podcast will go. Sometimes you think, this is going to be an hour, and it ends up being 2. Sometimes it's like, we can do 2 hours in this, and you're struggling at 45 minutes.
Right.
Yep.
So,
that was fantastic.
It's always good to have backup plans.
And before we go, Stephen wants to talk to us a little bit about some of the URLs and links to some of his websites and things. So, Stephen, tell us what you want to make sure we get in here before we close out the podcast.
Yeah, if people are interested in my work, they can find pretty much everything I do at StephenDSullivan.com. That's Stephen with a PH, or just for shorter, SDSullivan.com. That's my main website and has links to everything else. If you're particularly interested in Dr. Cushing's Chamber of Horrors, you can go to this URL, and that'll take you to the Patreon, where if you pay $1, you get the every chapter sent to your email box, and if you pay $2, you get them all in advance of when they're actually public. Right. And that is CushingHorrors.com. That's Cushing as in Peter Cushing, and horrors as in horrors. So I'm pretty easy to find. You can probably Google the heck out of me too. So
definitely.
But I am not the football player for LSU, nor am I the hockey player.
I kept finding the hockey player. Yep.
Well, you got to spell your name with like a PH and have the D, and that brings you up pretty quick.
Yep.
Right. And I'm on Facebook as Steve Sullivan, so you can find me there too. And I think I've got Steve D. Sullivan for SDS Books or something like that. I'm on Facebook. You can find me there.
Very cool. It was fantastic. Well, Stephen, thanks for being on our show, buddy. We really appreciate it. And that's going to end it there for us. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.